Bob Costa, we saw over the weekend on television the new head of the communications at the White House in a couple of appearances that I saw with John Dickerson, also on CNN. What does he bring in, and what does his arrival signal?
The arrival of Anthony Scaramucci, a Wall Street financier and Trump confidant, at least over the last 6 months or so, it signals a presidency that is moving to a loyalty-based operation, an aversion to leaks, an aversion to the Republican establishment. Scaramucci does not have deep political experience. He's been a Republican donor, not a Republican strategist or consultant. And when you watched him on the Sunday shows, you saw him speaking directly to President Trump, almost in an attempt to calm the president as all of these dramas unfold. This was not a messaging operation. This was not some kind of new Republican way coming in. This is a loyalist, replacing a Republican operative in Sean Spicer. The president is turning to these types of people at this time.
So when you look at all of this now, this is sort of the central act. Will the president, we're looking at a 6-month here evaluation of the president, what might he hope to have achieved by the time he gets to the midterm elections?
You know, Charlie, I think the problem for the president is that even though he was elected to 4 years, all political time is not created equal. And this first year of a presidency, and particularly the first 6 months, which he's now completed, it's the time when presidents have their most power. It's when the public is willing to cut him a break. It's when Congress is most deferential. It's when the big achievements on legislation typically have been passed in the first year. For the Affordable Care Act and Barack Obama, it took about 14 months, but clearly the groundwork laid in this first year. And what do we see with President Trump? We see not a single major legislative achievement. We find real confusion about what's going to happen with the Affordable Care Act, with key Senate vote there tomorrow. And what's consuming his presidency is a scandal over Russian meddling and the questions and the allegations about whether there might have been some collusion by his associates. This is not the recipe for a president who can count on getting things done, because, man, if you can't get things done your first year, it is really tough to get things done in the second year when members of Congress are worried most about their own reelection prospects.
You're shaking your head.
You know, I think Susan's absolutely right. I mean, you have more political capital right after an election than you're ever going to have again. The problem for Trump, though, which is largely of his own making but not entirely, is this election shook down in such an unusual way. He lost the popular vote by 3 million votes. He didn't have the traditional stash of political capital that an incoming president has. But what he has had, he has frittered away. And I don't see how the next 18 months look a whole lot better than the last 6. He's making changes. Bob Costa talked about Anthony Scaramucci coming. I found that very interesting, because if there's a lesson from his first 6 months, it's that his team does not know the ways of Washington well enough, and so now he's replaced someone who knew those ways somewhat with someone who's a complete newcomer. It suggests to me he's more interested in the emotional climate right around him than what necessarily is going to be tactically successful.
Well, also, yes, go ahead, Bob.
Just to build on that point by Frank, I think it's a smart insight, because instead of turning to people who know Washington, inside of the White House, my sources there tell me that the discussions are really about who knows Trump, who understands the president. He wants to be surrounded by people who get his New York combative ways. Scaramucci has the same type of personality. Trump has never felt comfortable with some of the Republicans around him in a deep sense. And so you have an administration, a White House, a West Wing becoming more Trump, not more Republican. It's
a little bit like circling the wagons, isn't it?
You could say that.
Yeah. It's a metaphor, though. I mean, this is a president who I think makes everything about him. And I think you could really fairly say, until he learns to make things more about the country he's serving, about the people out there, the voters, and not what feels good, not about applause, not about crowd sizes, until he can really kind of take himself a little bit out of the equation, he's not going to be able to accomplish the things he says he wants to accomplish.
But, Hugh, it's unlikely that Donald Trump would select those kinds of people like Howard Baker or and Duberstein. They were not the kind of people that that he knew or was confident in or believed in.
Well, there are 2 cabinet secretaries on thin ice right now, the Attorney General Sessions and Secretary of State Tillerson, about whom rumors are swirling today. If either of those go, expect a hardliner, meaning a combative personality who knows their stuff, say Judge Luttig from Boeing, maybe Rudy Giuliani, although I can't see him getting confirmed by the Senate for the Attorney Generalship. Look for a John Bolton over at State, not a Bob Corker. And I also think, where I would disagree a little bit with folks, we're forgetting Justice Gorsuch. That is a monumental accomplishment. People get tired of me bringing it up. It will change the law in the United States for 30-plus years. And if I were the president, I would go upstairs to the second floor, throw the door open on White House counsel McGahn's office, and demand my 20 circuit court nominees by the end of next week. Because the way to keep conservatives with your back covered and to move forward is to make sure that the courts, which matter to them more than almost anything else, even more than Obamacare, are taken care of.
I just want to push back at one thing. I mean, it's a monumental accomplishment if what you mean by that is that it is going to have great consequence going forward, and that it has followed through on something that Donald Trump promised, and it's certainly very important for conservatives. Let's just not forget that in order to accomplish that, the Senate had to get rid of its traditional filibuster of Supreme Court nominees. So, I mean, that does mitigate the accomplishment somewhat.
Well, the pushback on the
pushback,
though, it was just they were just using the Reid rule, Frank. The guy who broke the filibuster was Harry Reid, and it was applied to the D.C. Circuit.
Supreme Court nominees.
Not for
Supreme Court nominees. That was another, escalation.
But the Reid rule was that you could change the rules of the Senate with a simple majority, which is what Leader McConnell did using the Reid rule, and which, by the way, might be used again. Blue slip tradition of holding back judges, and might be used again and again. In many respects, if you have a complaint with Gorsuch, you ought to send it to Harry Reid.
No, and I will grant you that if the shoes were on the other feet, Democrats might at some point have done the same thing. I'm just saying when we're talking about it as an accomplishment, a Republican majority confirmed a Republican president's Supreme Court nominee. That's not that monumental to me.
I think he's.
I would also just say that conservative voters may well be very happy with Neil Gorsuch. His confirmation would be very happy with more conservative justices on the appellate courts. But the voters who put Donald Trump in the White House include a lot of people who are not traditional conservatives, who did not vote on the basis of judges, who voted on the basis of getting manufacturing jobs back or getting their health premiums reduced. And those voters are not going to be satisfied with the message that says, hey, look at Neil Gorsuch.
Let me bring up the issue in terms of foreign policy of Russian sanctions and Trump's relationship after 6 months, the president's relationship with the Republicans in Congress after 6 months?
It's a fascinating question because you see Republicans in Congress have a traditional Republican view of Vladimir Putin, of Russia, a hawkish take, a view that he is perhaps on some fronts a human rights abuser, he is murdering journalists, he is trying to disrupt U.S. elections, and yet you have inside of the White House and parts of this administration people who want to reimagine U.S.-Russia relations. And this is a real standoff between the GOP and the Republican president because the president shows no signs of acknowledging or really going along with the congressional impulse when it comes to Russia.
But did the president, in a sense, with the health care debate and what happened there, did he lose whatever confidence he might have had in the Republicans in Congress, especially the House?
Republicans, I was just at Congress over the weekend talking to congressmen and there last week, is they really feel like they've made so many mistakes in how they've sold this piece of legislation. Instead of talking about regulations and taxes, they've become mired in a debate over Medicaid and health care coverage for people who are poor, all as many Republican governors are clamoring to make sure that Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act remains. And they don't have the votes because the moderates are uneasy. Conservatives want much bigger cuts and reforms to the Affordable Care Act. And this is the burden for Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, that they've made this promise to the Republican base, yet the law has become